Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Paul Cowlins, naturopathic physician and former professor of naturopathic medicine in Portland, Oregon. And welcome back to my series on salutogenic terrain medicine, where I explore novel paradigms in biology and medicine, including so-called natural medicine, in order to expand our understanding of the human being, health, and disease. Please don't forget to share, like, and subscribe if you find this content valuable. And this is the ninth lecture in the series, and I'll be building on what I've gone over in the previous lectures, so I'll include a link to the last lecture for you to review if you haven't seen that yet. So I've started the discussion in the last video of what appears to be a sort of third system of organization that can be perceived specifically in animals and human beings, what I refer to as the air organization. And I talked last time about how that air organization in the realm of plants sort of seems to stand outside, and then in animals and humans, we see an internalization of those external forces. Perceiving this level of organization requires a more subtle way of knowing, the so-called feeling or air cognition that I spoke about, or what the Austrian philosopher Rudolf Steiner referred to as inspirative consciousness. And that allows for the perception of more subtle gestures, subtle movements, and feelings. It's a level of perception more subtle than that of the fluid imaginative cognition I discussed in relationship to the fluid organism. This air organization is a system of inner forces that activates and makes its appearance in the process of human-animal gastrulation during embryologic development. So remember, in gastrulation, you start with the blastula, a ball of growing cells, and then a mass of cells on the outside begins to invaginate, moves inwards, and it creates an inner space. And in that inner space, all of the tissues that will create the future body of the animal, the human being, will come about. So that inner space now is as if the air or the activities outside the blastula have now been internalized. There's this process of internalization. And in the animal kingdom, starting with invertebrates, those externalized processes still remain largely external to the animal. And then gradually, as you go and look at more and more complex animals, you see an internalization of those outer processes. So this process of gastrulation will start the process of differentiation that will result in a system of inner organs, a neuroendocrine system, a musculoskeletal system, all enclosed within an inner skin. And unlike the vegetative fluid processes evident in the plant kingdom, animals and humans now have a real capacity for movement, driven by a system of nerves and muscles, which again is different than sort of the nerve-like endings in the roots. In plants, for example, in trees, we do know that they now communicate, trees with one another under the soil via mycorrhiza, plant fungi, but they're not using an actual neurons like we see in animals, so nerve cells. There's also a different orientation in the animal kingdom in relationship to gravity. So plants have more of a vertical orientation, roots down, blossoms up, versus in the animals now, there's a horizontal relationship of the spine to the plane of gravity. And we'll see in human beings, something interesting happens, that plane again shifts again. But in the animal realm, there is this more horizontal relationship. And again, that's sort of it facilitates the movement across, across the surface of the earth, swimming, flying, and so forth. If you move again from the invertebrates to invertebrates in the animal kingdom, there's greater and greater internalization of processes that remain exterior to the plant. So things like the solar rhythms and warmth, temperature in mammals, that starts to internalize into an internal temperature system. Reproductive rhythms that stand outside the lower invertebrates now have internalized in mammals, and there's a uterus, there's an inner lunar cycle with the menstrual cycle, which is as if it's an internalization of an outer rhythm. Same thing with metabolic rhythms, breathing and circulatory rhythms, and so forth. So all of this contributes to the maintenance of that internal environment, or what Claude Bernard, the physiologist in the late 1800s, called the milieu intérieur, and then Walter Cannon in the 1920s called this system that maintains an inner environment homeostasis. So in animals now, there's an inner homeostatic environment, and especially if you get into the warm-blooded animals now, there's an internal ability to regulate this environment with a very high precision as the outer environment changes, and as temperature and whatnot externally change, the animal can maintain an internal environment. Finally, if you really delve into this inner world and use this inspirative cognition I've been speaking about, there's a sense that animals contain an inner world of sensations, instincts, feelings, which come to expression in outer movements and vocalizations, things like croaking and crying and barking and singing. So there's an inner world, and that is being expressed outwardly through sound, but also through movement. And this inner world correlates with what we experience as feelings. So there's an inner feeling activity going on inwardly. There's the ability to sense, to relate those senses in different ways. And so this is what historically people have called a soul. Now, soul and spirit are often equated, but just as a little hint here, as I go further into the next body, the so-called warmth body, you see that there's a different aspect that emerges there in human beings, which we might more applicably use the word spirit. So soul here more refers to this inner capacity for sensation and for consciousness, at least on simple levels. This soul element, as I discussed in previous lectures, is more external to the plant and sort of touches the plant at the periphery. So for example, the blossom color, we can almost think of a soul element coming into the plant. And then in some plants, like the nightshades, as I discussed, that air element, that external sort of soul element in the plant, submerges in the plant all the way to the point of creating nitrogen or air-like compounds, and these are called the alkaloids. And they all have effects on animal consciousness. So if an animal or human being ingests them, they affect our nervous systems in particular ways, things like caffeine and atropine and so forth. As I mentioned in the last video, the Austrian philosopher Rudolf Steiner referred to this inner system of air organization as what he called the astral body. And this was taken from many prior traditions, but he differentiated this astral body from the etheric body, which comes through expression through the fluid organization. So the astral works more through the gas, inner air organization within us. And in this video, I want to go deeper and explore Steiner's insights into the astral body and how it interacts with the etheric body. Insights he discussed through the lens of inspirative cognition. And then after reviewing that, in the next video, I want to go through some of the really interesting research on the effects of electromagnetic fields and inner light, so-called biophotons, in regulating our physiology as well as consciousness. So that'll be more taking some of the things I'll be discussing here and relating it through the lens of Earth consciousness. So first, let's talk about the astral body. And to do that, we need to first review Steiner's description of the etheric body, that is, that fluid organization. So again, the etheric body is the seat of our life activities, metabolism, repair, regeneration, growth, and reproduction. And again, without becoming metaphysical or postulating, vital forces and so forth, I'm just describing this as a level of organization. Now, if we just say that that's all explained away by genetics and molecular biology, that's one thing, but there's this level of organization above purely mineral organization. We take chemical elements, phosphorus, nitrogen, sulfur, carbon, and bring them in our physiology to a higher level of organization than you see in the simple mineral world. So there's this idea of negative entropy, highly structured, and that's working through those structured water. Remember, the water in us takes on sort of a fourth phase, according to the biophysicist Gerald Pollack. An engineer, Pollack really argues that that's the majority of water in our cells and so forth, and again, many others say this as well, is really organized in a very highly structured manner. And in that form, it takes on lower entropy, it can store charge, and this charge distribution, ultimately we're finding, is what helps to regulate gene expression and helps to regulate the process of tissue development, or so-called morphogenesis. So these are a higher system, a higher level of control than just the molecular biology and the genetics itself. It's as if guiding the chemistry to its final outcome. So that's kind of the idea of the etheric body, working through the fluid element. It's guiding the material, the physical aspect, to a different level of organization. As I mentioned in the last couple of videos, one of Steiner's insights about the etheric body, which we now have some evidence for from the idea of structured water and coherent domains, is that water, essentially in our tissues, our organs, our muscles, can hold memory. So our memory structures, we might think of the structured water within us, liquid crystalline water, as a sort of giant database. It's storing memories from our past traumas, our past experiences, and these can be activated when we actually physically work on tissues through massage or acupuncture and so forth. This whole system of organizing forces in the fluid, the etheric body, is really, according to Steiner, really the source of our health. It's constantly seeking to regenerate us like a plant to regrow, to heal tissues, and so forth. It's the source of physiologic salutogenesis, as I've been discussing. And this is what the ancient Greeks referred to as the vis medicatrix naturae, those inner forces. So the etheric body and the vis medicatrix really are very similar concepts here. Now, the astral body, this third system of organizing forces in animals and humans, is quite different according to Steiner's descriptions, but if we just make simple observations. So Astra refers to star, and so we can move this as a star body, but specifically refer to stars, for example, not the fixed stars, but the so-called moving stars, which are the planets. And planets we can think of as having rhythms. So they have, cycles around the sun, and they act as sort of timekeepers in this way. So in Steiner's conception, it's more these rhythms that become internalized in animal and human physiology, and they become the rhythms of our physiology, but also our feeling life. Physiologically, these rhythms express themselves through breathing, through cerebral spinal fluid rhythms, circulatory rhythm, metabolic rhythms, reproductive cycles. All our different hormones have rhythms, thyroid, for example, insulin, and so forth. And Steiner argued that all of these rhythms are internalized celestial rhythms, which is an interesting concept. And again, looking at the reproductive rhythm, that's probably the most obvious, but we also have a daily solar rhythm, the so-called circadian rhythm. And so it's not that far of a stretch to argue and to begin to consider the idea that we also have other rhythms, shorter and longer than a day, which correlate perhaps with the rhythms of the planets. So for example, the 12-year cycle of Jupiter or the 28, 29-year cycle of Saturn, that these could be internalized rhythms, which we just haven't studied that much. And it's these rhythms that essentially regulate our internal environment. So I made the argument that life is not so much a thing, it's a process or activity that works through rhythms. And the astral body here, according to Steiner's conception, is what helps, as I'll argue further here, helps to support the life activities through establishing these inner rhythms. Further, this astral body is the seat of what we might call animal consciousness or soul. And that's the capacity for sensation to have memory and reflect in inner life, inner activities through feelings, through thoughts. The source of instincts, and what one might in a person call their personality, in a sense, comes out through all of their past experiences, their ideas, their feeling state. All of that contributes to what we call personality. Now, the thinking I'm talking about here with the astral is more what we might call conditioned or subconscious thinking, that we're programmed. We tend to program ourselves to act in certain ways, either consciously or unconsciously. But there's a capacity for another type of thinking, a higher order thinking, which I'll be discussing in future videos. But this is more we might say, our everyday consciousness as we approach the world and do the things we need to do. We are just usually going on the basis of pre-programmed thoughts and so forth. One of the very important insights that Steiner had about the astral body, and this is not, again, unique to Steiner, it's a very old idea, is that the astral body works to essentially restrain, to shape, and to form the etheric body. If we were just a mass ball of cells, a massive ball of living activity, there'd be no capacity for consciousness. So a very interesting insight from Steiner is that essentially the astral body catabolizes the etheric body, and in the process it shapes it into the organs and whatnot that we see, but that the liberation of those forces, the life activities, now can be used at a higher level for our thinking. This was an interesting idea in the 19th century, so it's not unique to Steiner, but the idea that life and consciousness are actually opposed in a certain way. Without having a certain degree of consciousness and catabolic activity to shape things, we would just be a giant cabbage, basically. So there has to be something that constantly restrains that life process. And in the activities of animal and human embryogenesis, developing the embryo and whatnot, It's very interesting and very different than plants. We go through, after gastrulation, several internal phases that essentially create tissues, but then they break down, and then there's another creation. They break down, another creation. So there's this catabolic process as opposed to just the simple growing anabolic processes we see in plants. And these processes then shape the etheric. Steiner called those processes the etheric formative forces. And there's a bit of a misunderstanding, I think, even in the so-called anthroposophic community that took Steiner's ideas about medicine. They often equate the etheric forces, those are those quantum-like forces in the water that I talked about, with the etheric formative forces. Etheric formative forces work at a higher level to shape. And my argument here is they're actually coming, according to Steiner's descriptions, they are internalizations of planetary rhythms, and they're associated with the lower aspects of the so-called astral body in Steiner's idea. So this astral activity is opposed to the etheric activity. And it's in that relationship there has to be the right balance. So too much catabolism can result in illness. Too much anabolism or growth can result in illness. So there has to be a constant balance between the two. And Steiner argued essentially it's in that balance, and especially in the astral body itself, that the potential for disease exists. So the etheric is constantly trying to restore health, and the astral is constantly trying to create disease in a way. And so that balance needs to be maintained between the two. And so this can be actually evidenced all the way down. This catabolizing aspect of the astral body can be evidenced all the way down to the nerves. If you look at neurons, the nerve cells, they are just on the brink of death, basically. They're actually kept alive usually by supporting cells in the brain. These are called glial cells, as well as in the rest of the body. And these supporting cells really give nourishment and hormones to give the nerves life. But nerves are in many areas of the body, if they are destroyed, especially the so-called cell body, where the nucleus and the genome of the neuron lives, that nerve cell, of course, is not going to grow again. And unlike other tissues in your skin, where you're having a constant regeneration of cells, as well as tissues like the organ or the liver, organs like the liver, there's a constant burgeoning life process. Nerves are not like that. In fact, we form at birth the majority of nerves we'll ever have, and through a process of pruning, we constantly are losing neurons, nerve cells, and they are reconnecting to form in more efficient ways to form our memories and our thought patterns and so forth. But the actual life activities is as if stripped away from the neuron. And Steiner argued that activity that was once in growth has now been liberated for consciousness. There's a similar idea in limb regeneration, so-called lower animals, amphibians like salamanders. If they lose their tail or an arm or a leg, they can regenerate it all, the cartilage, the nerves, the blood vessels, the skin, everything, muscles. So all of that will regenerate. But as you go into more complex animals where we're seeing higher and higher levels of consciousness, then in a way we're seeing less of a capacity for limb and organ regeneration. And what we now know is that it's not that we are incapable of that, but it's as if the patterns, and again, the kind of research is emerging around this, is that these patterns are bioelectrical patterns that in tissues maintain the forms and the shapes of the organs by stimulating gene expression and so forth. These patterns are as if stopped at a certain stage of development. And again, we can actually, through different things, we can reactivate them through using ion channel drugs that can create changes in electrical states of your tissues and so forth. But in the, Steiner argued that it's because we have higher consciousness that has stripped away some of those activities. This is a very ancient idea in biology, and I think it's very important to understand in medicine. There's a difference between form, what we might call form, shape, and substance, what makes up that form. So think of a glass vessel. The glass is the substance, but then it can be shaped in any number of forms. Going back to ancient Greek philosophy, the philosopher Aristotle argued that there's a distinct difference, and this is called Aristotle's hylomorphism, that form and substance are not the same, that something must put form into the substance. Example is maybe a potter. You have a block of clay, and then the potter's hands shape that clay. So most of medicine up to this date has really studied the substance, what is the actual substance of our cells, our tissues. We look at the molecules and the soup of things that are there, but what is directing all of that? A lot of people argue, well, that's in the genome, but that's actually not the case. The genome, something else seems to be regulating the genome to express different proteins. That's really all the gene in the genome is a map for your proteins, a blueprint for proteins. But what turns it on and off, when and where, and how, which tissues are active, which are inactive, expressing different proteins, this is still a great mystery. And so there's as if something else working outside. Well, I've been arguing that there's a bioelectric code, according to research from, for example, Michael Levin at Tufts University. This is an interesting area of research. But I'm arguing here is these are the astral forces which are helping to shape that. But then the astral catabolizes some of the life activity, so it prevents proper regeneration of different tissues. The teeth are another example. If we could regenerate teeth, we wouldn't need dentists. But in a way, Steiner argued the very fact that we get permanent teeth around the age of 7 is because the forces before that were active in growth have now been essentially pulled away from those tissues and are being utilized for higher thinking. Interesting idea to reflect on. Another important distinction I want to make here is the difference between energy and information. There's a lot of discussion about energy medicine and how we need to give energy or direct energy in a certain way. We can think of energy really as being matter with physical energies like the electric charges stored in that coherent water and so forth. So the physical energies, gravity, electromagnetism, and so forth, we can think of that as a type of substance. And what's interesting in the body is that in addition to needing energy, something needs to direct that energy. Usually that's the enzymes and whatnot in the cells, but then what is directing that? And I'm arguing here it's information from the water structures, and then even higher now coming from the so-called astral field and the establishment of bioelectric fields in the tissues. This is helping to shape the energy. Example is maybe traffic with a lot of energy on a highway. A single traffic light, which uses low energy, can direct that stream of energy. And so that's really the deeper question. What is directing the energy, not the energy itself? And that's where I think a lot of medicine is missing this question. How do we direct the growth of tissues? How do we direct the proper maintenance of form and so forth? And we're finding that is much more related to this concept of information, not just energy. So I would make an argument that we should really, when we talk about these more subtle levels of organization, these are more information forces and activities, not so much energy forces or activities. They are directing the energies of the physical body to their right destinies, to their right goals. So healing is not so much about giving energy, it's about giving the proper information. And my argument all along here is that many of the substances used even in natural medicines are not giving a lot of information. So vitamins don't give a lot of information. They give a very specific kind of information, which can be necessary, but it's not enough often to direct an organ towards proper regeneration or function. I would argue that herbal compounds, herbs really with all of their compounds in a synergistic way, prepared in the right way, can give this information forces, as well as minerals and metals that are prepared therapeutically. These all can activate the information forces that are dormant from the astral. So this is an interesting kind of concept there. So healing is really about giving the right information, not so much about giving energy. Now, going back to the astral, the way Steiner talked about it, he didn't say this explicitly, it's as if we have two astral bodies within us. One is shaping and organizing the tissues, and that's very active in early life, especially embryogenesis and the first 7 years of life. This astral field really takes on, it's as if it's an internalization of the external rhythms. So again, the solar rhythm, the lunar rhythm, and so forth. So that is one aspect of the astral, is the more universal astral activity. But then we have a personal astral, and that is linked to our consciousness and our personality. And that personal astral is the potential seat for illness. It is constantly stressing the rhythms, the natural rhythms. We work against them. We don't sleep at the right time or eat at the right times. We're not always in sync with these outer rhythms, which in a way we have that capacity. We've internalized the rhythm, so we have a certain freedom from the rhythms. We don't have to be in sync with the lunar rhythm. As long as that 28, 29-day rhythm is internalized, you don't have to be actually synced with the moon in the sky in its different phases for a proper reproductive rhythm. But this idea of essentially, the personality, but we say the forces of stress, but also our memories, our traumas, our subconscious programming about who we think we are and how we behave. This is all constantly stressing the rhythms, and that's causing a breakdown in the coherent water and domains in the cells. So that is a potential source of illness. So we need to strip life away to have consciousness and do the things we need to do in the world, but there has to be a balance between that and the inner life activities. And this is really the role, as Steiner described, of sleep. In sleep, our consciousness, the so-called astral body, leaves. It's as if it disconnects. We're no longer conscious in the same way. We seem to enter, if we retain some consciousness, into a different space, the so-called dream space. And, that's Steiner and many others argue that is an actual real place we go. It is not in the physical world, but we might say it's a higher dimensional world, essentially, and it has different laws and different behaviors. But in that state, we disengage the nervous system, and now essentially all of the processes that heal the body through the etheric body can now be reestablished. The natural rhythms can now be reestablished. So it's as if we hit the reset switch during the sleep cycle. And this is the need for sleep, is that consciousness during the day is constantly breaking down the body, and we need to then regenerate it at night. Steiner argued that this consciousness, and when I talk about consciousness here, I'm referring to more everyday a fight or flight response kind of consciousness where we're dealing with life stressors and whatnot. That's the kind of consciousness. There are other types of consciousness, as I've been arguing, that are more in the meditative space and whatnot. And those types we'll see, and I'll be going into this in future lectures, are very restorative to these inner rhythms. So learning how to change ourselves and to flip out of the daily fight or flight mode is very important for maintaining health. But it can be seen that life and consciousness are essentially opposed. There's an opposition, there's a constant tension between them. The etheric activities give life, the astral activities lead to consciousness. And so there's this tension between the etheric and the astral body. So these forces this balance is very important to maintain in health. And, the astral is essentially, as Steiner argued, taking away life activities from the nerves, from the neurons, the nerve cells, but also organs, and that this can create essentially illness in the body. And in animals, that inner world, those inner astral air organization, air forces manifest outwardly in their movements, but even to the point of their body plans. And so it's interesting to think, and this is again an idea from 19th century zoology, that each animal represents a different feeling state in their actual body plans. That's just an interesting thought to kind of reflect on. But it does touch upon a deeper issue with humans, and that is that what we call mental health disorders, anxiety, depression, and so forth, that these aren't just in the brain and the nerves, but they actually are embedded in the tissues. So essentially, one of the places we might need to be looking clinically at how to work with mental health disorders is not just through the nervous system and so-called neurotransmitters, giving substances to support that, whether it be pharmaceuticals or natural products, but also looking at how organ health plays into our mental emotional states. And correcting imbalances functionally in the liver, in the kidneys, in the cardiac rhythms, breathing rhythms, all of this can then have profound changes on our mental emotional life. So that expands our ability to maybe look a little bit further. Ultimately, if those consciousness forces work too deeply into a tissue, we start to notice it. We have an awareness of it. And if they continue to work in and strip away the life activities, we notice pain. So pain really is increased consciousness in a place where there wasn't consciousness before. You're normally not aware of your intestines and your liver and whatnot. But if there's a problem in those organs, you start to feel pain, first maybe discomfort and then pain. So in a way, consciousness, the astral activities become stuck, lodged in there. In Chinese medicine, there's this idea that pain essentially is what they call constricted qi, And we can think of chi really as the sort of astral forces gliding into the water, so a mixture of the airy and the watery kind of elements. Um, this idea of qi constriction or wind is another aspect in Chinese medicine. These are more traditional imaginative terms applied to this activity. In the Western, there are Western systems of qualitative physiology from the 19th century. I've mentioned earlier the physiomedicalists. They looked at tissue states, and the constricted or tense tissue state is what really would correlate to this excessive astral activity working into the etheric body. So essentially, we can think of astral forces like the wind as being drying and desiccating, and they essentially create a sort of stiffness in the tissues, increase the process of what's called sclerosis. That's the deposition of collagen and maybe even minerals and other deposits in the tissues that then create a hardening and a stiffening. So that is an example of too much consciousness in a way working through there. As we age and we go more and more into consciousness, maybe thinking about life, carrying life stressors, our body ages significantly. You see that in the skin, more leathery, more mineral-like, and so forth. So the juicy, watery, buoyant life activities are stripped away. Now, another aspect that Steiner discussed in relationship to the astral body is that from the perspective of inspirative consciousness, we essentially experience the astral body as a sort of inner light body. So this light body, if we observe it, takes on what Steiner described as different color states, and many have heard of this in relationship to what's called the aura. So the color states really are something we don't necessarily see with our physical eyes, but we see with a sort of a higher sense. So if we meditate on colors like blue, there's a certain inner feeling that comes with that. But we can also think of physiology as being in a blue state, more of a cold, depressed physiology, versus a hot, inflamed physiology would be more red, or hot, inflamed feeling like anger would be more red. And, people talk about this in relationship to feeling. So green with envy, you're feeling blue today, red with anger, and so forth. So Steiner really was inspired by the German poet Goethe, as I discussed earlier. And Goethe spent a considerable amount of his time working with scientific studies, sort of trying to develop a alternative or maybe a different vision for science than what was developing in the late 1700s. Science, Goethe felt, was becoming too analytical, and one of the areas he really attacked was Newton's color theory. The idea that Isaac Newton thought that white light is composed of colors and that the prism splits out the colors. Everyone learns this in physics. But interestingly, Goethe argued that's not actually the case. And, what he argued is essentially there is this phenomena of light, he called absolute light, which interacts with matter, which he called absolute dark. And it's the interaction of light and dark that creates colors. And that's a long discussion for here. But essentially, phenomena like looking at the darkness of space through a light-filled atmosphere gives us the impression of blue-violet, versus looking at a light source like the setting sun against the clouded atmosphere will give the experience of red, orange, yellow. So Goethe argued really there are two spectra, a dark and a light, and they come together. We see green, or they come together with the red and violet, and that forms magenta, which is a color that normally we don't see. He called this the special peach blossom color. And interestingly, Steiner argued the color of the etheric body is that special color, which is visible through Goethe's dark spectrum. But really, the absolute light in this case would be the astral light, as Steiner called it. And the astral light interacting with matter in the body creates colors. So we experience the astral as different colors in different areas through more inspirative consciousness. And again, the colors can be associated with physiologic states. And I'll be going into that to really create a model of physiology and pathophysiology based on qualities. And that's going to be an important step here. And what I'm really working towards in these lectures is to create sort of a model that would be very clinically applicable. So for those of you who are wondering, where's all this philosophy going? My hope is that we're going to steer there very quickly. So in the next video, I'm going to discuss a lot more about the inner light and the new research about biophotons and how this is a system of communication within our tissues, in addition to biomechanics, biochemistry, and even the bioelectric fields that I've hinted about here, which I'll go into more detail later. But basically, this electromagnetic or light information is how our cells can communicate via these electromagnetic information. Now, I'm calling light electromagnetic. Steiner actually said light is not electromagnetic. It is a phenomena above electromagnetism, but that it comes into the physical world through electromagnetic phenomena. So we might say that light is even a spiritual phenomena, which is then physicalized through the electromagnetism. But that's more for a discussion later. But before I end this video and jump into the next video on the biophotons, I just wanted to ask one question here, or leave you all with one question, and that is, I've talked about the etheric formative forces. What are the material carriers of those forces? If we really examine that closely, we find that on a molecular level, they're none other than the secretions of the neuroendocrine immune system. So what we would call hormones, cytokines, and neurotransmitters are the actual material carriers of these astral formative forces or inner light forces. So they are they're just from an earth-based consciousness, what we see in the material realm, but on this higher mode, we can think of them all as inner light. So it's interesting to think about different hormones as having their own colors, different neurotransmitters as having their own colors in this way. And then we can start thinking about how all of those interact. Gives us a different sense above the sort of molecular mechanical models that we typically use in medicine. And I'll be going into that more. As a closing thought, it's interesting to see how our neuroendocrine system really is aligned along the central axis with all the major glands, pineal, pituitary, thyroid, thymus, going all the way down, that these glands essentially are the mediators of those forces. We can think of each gland as the center of a field which extends throughout the body. Sort of, it's attracting information in a way from external fields and then radiates that throughout the body. And that the hormones we measure, thyroid and whatnot, are only one aspect of that. And that's why often just giving thyroid hormone or giving, adrenal hormones or whatnot is not enough. There's a lot of other subtle aspects about the hormone life, for example, proper physiologic rhythms that have to be maintained. So this field that's centered in each gland essentially has a lot of complex activities. We can think of these so-called neuroendocrine centers. Each gland has its own nerve ganglia around it, nerve bundles, which then innervate the surrounding organs. These glands are all essentially physical expressions of the astral. We can think of the astral as having its own organs, and they are the glandular system. And this is in more traditional cultures, like in Ayurvedic medicine, they describe these centers, these neuroendocrine centers, as having their own inner light. And that is the so-called wheels or chakras, the lotus blossoms that are discussed in those cultures. So this is a very ancient idea, but again, we're beginning to see connections with some of the more modern physiologic research. So the end point I want to leave here is that essentially in the astral, there are 7 major endocrine glands, 7 major life processes, which regulates all of the etheric activities and the life activities. And the material carriers for these are, on one level, the hormones, but also what are called cytokines, which are proteins secreted by the immune system, as well as neurotransmitters, which are the compounds secreted, used by nerves for their proper transmission. But this number 7 is important. And what's interesting, going back to ancient astronomy, it was thought there were 7 major planets up to Saturn, and they were all arranged in the so-called geocentric model with the Earth at the center in spheres around the Earth. And what's interesting is if you take that map and put it over the human body, we line up the planets with the chakra system itself. So to think of this old alchemical idea that the macrocosm, the world out there, is essentially represented in our microcosm, our inner world. So we are directly connected this way. And that opens up interesting questions. Can we take human beings from the Earth and pluck them onto a different planet and keep them well? Because they will be exposed to different outer kind of rhythms and environment. And will they get sick in that process? I'll just leave that as an open question for now. Okay, so that's more on the etheric formative forces. But this idea of the astral body, which we see internalized in animals and human beings, it's again in plants, it's more externalized. The astral body works as a system of organization through the airy and potentially light elements to organize the fluidic within us, the the etheric activities, the life activities. And these astral forces work more as information fields, not so much energy fields. And this information is what's structuring us and creating our organ and our tissues, but also being liberated for higher consciousness. So those are some of the insights from Rudolf Steiner and anthroposophy on the so-called astral body and the air inner light organization. I'll be going into a little bit more on the light aspect and some of the modern research around that. And then we'll come to our fourth level organization in the videos after that. So thank you so much for listening. And again, please feel free to share, like, and subscribe if you like this content. And I'll see you in the next video.